Ask an American with deep roots in southeastern Pennsylvania what their family is, and a good number will tell you, without hesitation, that they are Pennsylvania Dutch. They will say it the way you say something that has never once needed checking. It came from a grandmother. It was printed on the church cookbook. It is painted on the hex signs and stamped on the Shoofley pie boxes and hung over the tourist shops along the Lincoln Highway. And nearly every part of it is true except the word Dutch. They are not Dutch, they never were. Their ancestors did not come from the Netherlands, did not speak Netherlandic, did not sail from Amsterdam or Rotterdam with any intention of remaining Hollanders in the New World. And the strangest part of this is that it is not a secret. It has never been hidden, never been suppressed, never required a laboratory to uncover. It is simply a misunderstanding so old and so comfortable that it hardened into an identity, and the people it describes eventually picked it up and wore it themselves. This is not a story about a lie. It is a story about how a name outlives the thing it was supposed to describe, and what happens when the biology finally gets asked to weigh in. The word is a ghost of another word. In their own tongue, these people called themselves Deutsch. Say it aloud, and you can hear exactly what happened. To an English ear in the 1700s, unaccustomed to the sound and uninterested in the distinction, Deutsch landed as Dutch, and the ear won. What Deutsch actually meant, and still means, is German. Their neighbors heard a foreign word, reached for the nearest English one, and the label stuck so firmly that 3 centuries later it survives on highway signs, while the language that produced it has nearly gone silent. So who actually came? Not Germans in the sense we mean today, because Germany did not exist. What existed was a shattered patchwork of principalities and bishoprics and free cities along the Rhine, a landscape that had been chewed through by decades of religious war, then chewed again by French armies, then hit by winters severe enough to kill the vines. The people who left came out of the Palatinate above all, and from the Rhineland, from Württemberg, from Alsace, and from the Swiss cantons. They were refugees in the oldest sense, fleeing a place that had stopped being survivable, and William Penn's colony was advertising something almost unheard of in that century. Land you could own, and the right to worship as you pleased without anyone burning your farm over it. The first party arrived in 1683 and founded Germantown, and here the story earns a wrinkle worth keeping. Those founding families came largely from Crefeld, hard against the Dutch frontier, and some of them were Mennonites whose lives had run through the Low Countries. So the word Dutch is not purely a mishearing. There is a thread of genuine Netherlandic connection buried at the very origin, a few strands in a rope that would soon be overwhelmingly German. History rarely gives us a clean mistake. It gives us a mistake with just enough truth in it to survive. Then came the flood. Through the middle of the 18th century, ship after ship unloaded German-speaking families onto the Philadelphia docks, and they moved inland to take the limestone soil of Lancaster and Berks and York, some of the richest farmland on the continent. They arrived in numbers large enough to alarm the colony's most famous citizen. Benjamin Franklin, who was not at his finest on this subject, complained in print that these newcomers were crude, that they clustered together, that they would not learn English, and that they would swamp the English character of Pennsylvania entirely. It is a remarkably familiar anxiety, written about people whose great-great-grandchildren would be considered the most quintessentially American farmers in the country. Every generation believes the newest arrivals are the ones who will never assimilate. Every generation is wrong in the same way, and here is where the popular picture goes crooked a second time. Say Pennsylvania Dutch, and most people see a horse and buggy, a black hat, a beard without a mustache, but the Amish and the Mennonites, the plain people, were always a minority within this migration. The great majority were Lutheran and German Reformed, what their own communities called the church people, and they were not separatists at all. They built brick churches and sang from printed hymnals and ran mills and printed newspapers, and eventually sent their sons into American politics and American industry. The plain communities are the visible sliver of a much larger world that quietly dissolved into the American middle. If your surname is Snyder or Wenger or Kreider or Zimmerman and your family has been in Pennsylvania since before the Revolution, you are probably descended from that majority, and no one ever told you because it stopped being remarkable. The language held on longer than anyone expected. Deutsch is not broken German, and it is not an accent. It is a real language descended from Palatine German, with its own grammar, its own literature, its own newspapers, spoken in Pennsylvania households for 200 years and more. What finally broke it was not time. It was the 20th century. 2 wars against Germany made a German tongue into a liability, and families who had spoken it since before there was a United States decided in a single generation to stop. Schools discouraged it. Children were shamed out of it. Speakers went quiet by choice to be safe. Outside the plain communities, where it still lives, the language died mostly in the mouths of people who were afraid. Which brings us at last to the genetics and to what makes this population one of the most intensively studied on Earth. Because within the plain communities, something happened that geneticists dream about and families live with. The Old Order Amish and the Old Order Mennonites descend from a very small number of founding couples, a few hundred people, and for roughly 3 centuries they have married almost entirely within their own communities. That produces what is called a founder effect, and it is the closest thing human history offers to a controlled experiment. The genetic variation those founders happened to carry became the entire genetic variation of everyone who came after. The consequences are precise and in some cases devastating. Conditions that are vanishingly rare in the general population appear in these communities at rates found nowhere else, and researchers have been able to trace certain of them back to specific 18th century ancestors by name. One such disorder, marked by short stature and extra fingers and heart defects, has been followed in Lancaster County back to a single man who arrived in the 1700s. Others affect how the body handles certain amino acids or clears certain compounds from the blood, and left untreated, they can kill an infant within days. Out of that reality came something genuinely moving. A small clinic in Lancaster County, built with the communities rather than imposed on them, that learned to read these genomes and catch these conditions early. Plain families, often caricatured as rejecting the modern world, have quietly participated in some of the most advanced genetic medicine ever practiced. And the same isolation that concentrated the harm also concentrated the surprises. Researchers studying an Amish community in the Midwest identified a mutation in a clotting-related gene that, in people carrying a single copy, appeared to be associated with longer telomeres and a longer average lifespan. The finding is limited from one extended family and needs far more work before anyone should make grand claims. But it is a genuine glimpse of something remarkable, a rare variant that seems to slow some part of aging itself, surfaced only because a small group of people kept meticulous genealogies and married close to home for 300 years. Now hold the 2 halves of this story together. Because the ordinary consumer DNA test, the tube of saliva that millions of Americans have mailed off, tells the same story in a much blunter way. When people with these roots open their results expecting the Netherlands, they do not get the Netherlands, they get Germany, they get the Rhineland and Switzerland and Alsace. The testing companies have gone so far as to identify Pennsylvania Dutch descendants as a distinct genetic community in their own right, clustering apart from other Americans, rooted in that particular stretch of limestone country, precisely because those families married among themselves for so long. The name says Dutch. The genome says otherwise, and it has been saying otherwise the entire time. Imagine standing in a Lancaster County graveyard on a cold morning. The stones are carved in German, in a script most visitors cannot read. The names on them belong to families still farming the fields on the other side of the wall. Somewhere down the road, there is a clinic where a physician can look at a child's blood and name the 18th century immigrant whose single mutation is causing the trouble. An ancestor who stepped off a ship in Philadelphia before there was a country to step into. The past is not a metaphor here. It is a diagnosis, That is what makes this one different from the other stories in this series. There is no conspiracy, no records officer with a pen, no court ruling erasing a category. Nobody took anything from these people. The misunderstanding was gentle, almost affectionate, and they eventually adopted it themselves, and it worked well enough for 300 years. The Pennsylvania Dutch were never Dutch. They were Palatins and Swabians and Swiss, refugees from a country that did not yet exist, who kept their language until the world made it dangerous, kept their farms when everyone expected them to sell, and kept in their bodies a record so precise that doctors can now read a name in it from the year 1744. They were never what the name said. They were something older and stranger and far more specific. The word was wrong. The blood was never confused at all.